Venus Cricket, South Africa, May 18th, 2008. Final, silent. But 2 weeks earlier, a junior accountant sent me the one email they forgot to recall, and that rewrote everything. The subject line was forgettable. Adjustments as advised per legal's phrasing. No urgency tag. No attachments. Just a routine-looking message sent from accounting to a distribution group 2 weeks before Miles was removed from payroll. It should have vanished into the clutter of automated approvals, expense rollovers, and quarterly scramble. Should have. But it didn't, because one name had stayed in the distribution list, Miles Conway. Not active. Not visible on the front-end directory, but still buried in a shared compliance loop, tied to an old audit testing protocol. It was a ghost route, one someone forgot to delete. And that one oversight became the doorway. Miles noticed it while scrubbing old system alerts. He wasn't searching for payback, just watching, observing like he always did. And there it was, an email meant for accountants and executives, forwarded automatically to a shadow inbox no one remembered existed. The language was off, not illegal, just vague in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck raise. Referencing line 14B for projected training disbursement. Will reroute through consulting ledger for Q2 shielding. Legal approved phrasing outlined in Doc 3H. Shielding. Not budgeting, not allocation. Shielding. The word sat wrong. It wasn't how internal memos were supposed to sound. Miles read it twice. Then a third time. Then he opened the full header metadata. What he found wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a footprint. The email had passed through a redirect filter tagged C_legal_mailer, an internal alias for legal-approved communications. Except this alias wasn't listed in the official directory. It was a hard-coded relay tied to only one user profile, M. Vane Opsaz, Marla Vane, CFO. Miles didn't panic, didn't call anyone. He simply extracted the raw payload, decrypted the proxy ID embedded in the mail route, and saved it under a quiet folder labeled echo_trace_5.1. From there, he followed the thread not through the company's front-end tools, but through the legacy system monitor he'd designed for redundancy control 3 years ago. A place where every bounced message, every CC mismatch, every off-book reroute lived. Quiet, forgotten, but still obedient. The thread branched. 17 messages over 8 weeks, all with similar phrasing. All referencing vague financial concepts cloaked in legal ambiguity. Consulting review consolidation, third-party training variants, compliance-shielded stipends. None of them had real vendor codes. Some had no invoice trails at all. But they had one thing in common. They all passed through that same C_legal_mailer alias. Miles built a map, a quiet one, node-based, not to present, just to understand. Each line pointed to another department, another account, another off-the-books vendor ID, and buried in one of the footers a strange phrase, mirror protocol to primary ledger, visible only via rollover key. That wasn't company language. That was system language, something only a back-end engineer would know to hide. And Miles recognized it because he had built it. 5 years ago as a safeguard, a dual-ledger mirror system created to detect internal accounting fraud. It had never been activated. Until now. He followed it through sandbox access and found what he wasn't supposed to. A duplicate payroll layer. One that only appeared when accessed through a proxy key. It didn't contain staff salaries. It listed contractor stipends, advisory fees, and external training packages. But Miles knew these weren't contractors. They were ghosts, not 3 like before. 14, some tied to non-existent projects, some tied to consulting firms that hadn't submitted a single deliverable, but all tagged with the same reviewer ID, ops_coup_Germain, Jeremy. Miles leaned back, eyes still on the screen, heart slow but steady. He didn't feel angry. He felt ready. They'd buried this beneath legal phrasing and compliance filters. They'd called it advised shielding, but the truth was simpler. They were moving money off ledger and hoping no one noticed. But someone did, not because he went looking, but because someone left a door open. A door called forgetfulness. The best part? The original email, the one that started it all, was still marked unread in his ghost inbox. untouched, unrecalled, still carrying the original headers in trace code, and just above the body of the message in the automated signature were 3 words: "Do not forward externally." Miles smiled. Not because he would, but because they thought they needed to say it, as if warning someone not to share a secret made the secret safe. He didn't reply. He didn't leak. He just documented, and in the top right corner of his private dashboard, he created a new folder, Chat, C5_init. Inside it, he saved the email, then the header trace, then a copy of the mirror ledger reference. Then he shut the laptop, stood, and whispered to the empty room. Let's see where this money thinks it's going. The name on the transfer record was forgettable, Haverly & Co. Advisory. No logo, no description, just a vendor tag attached to 6 wire transfers over 6 weeks, each marked Strategic Workforce Training and routed through a consulting ledger tied to a department Miles didn't recognize. What caught his attention wasn't the name itself, but the absence that followed it. No tax ID, no corporate registration, no signed contract in the procurement system. Just payments, clean, timed, and quietly invisible to anyone not filtering with a sandbox key. Miles didn't rush. He never did. He pulled the vendor code and ran it through the legacy archive directory, the one built to sync vendor approvals to state compliance databases. 0 hits. He checked the internal vendor request history. Again, nothing. The entry hadn't been onboarded like the others. It had been injected. Slipped into a side channel labeled Fast Track Contractor Alias List. Approved under a generic user group, ops_stream_1. That was strange. No one used that stream since they deprecated v1.4 of the vendor system 2 years ago. But the timestamp told a different story. This stream was used 4 times in the last quarter alone, always by one credential chain, ops_coup_Germain. Jeremy. Miles dug deeper. Haverly & Co. listed a mailing address, just one, a P.O. box in Stamford, Connecticut. He checked postal records. The box had been opened 8 months ago by an entity called Raylix Holdings. Raylix, as it turned out, had one former officer on record, a name Miles hadn't read in years, Cassandra Lynn Baird, former consultant, former co-founder of a defunct culture transformation firm dissolved in 2018. But more relevant than all that, Cassandra Lynn Baird was Jeremy's ex. And until 6 months ago, listed as a strategic external partner in his LinkedIn profile. No one remembered her, no one questioned the vendor, because no one looked. Until now, Miles didn't call it out, he followed it. One transfer, then another. He mirrored each transaction, compared the dates against internal project milestones. Every payment coincided with project cost-cutting initiatives. Headcounts down, consulting expenses up, same dollars just rerouted. It wasn't theft, it was obfuscation. They weren't stealing money, they were moving it to people who didn't exist on paper anymore, and the system let them. Because the oversight layers had been softened, filtered, and scattered just enough to pass a lazy review. Miles was not a lazy review. He'd printed out one transfer summary, clipped it to a folder. On the margin, he wrote one word, not real. Then he ran the name Haverly & Co. through external tax validation services. Still nothing. He tried payment processors. No merchant IDs, no payroll records, no 1099S. He checked the invoice archive. Every invoice listed for Haverly & Co. used the same formatting, same wording, same spacing. The metadata was even more telling. They were all generated by the same device. Not a company machine, a personal laptop, registered to a user tag that matched an old VPN login from Jeremy's prior consulting firm. Miles paused, leaned back, and drew one simple diagram. Funds from ops vendor, alias, consulting ledger, silent reroute, closed shell. All under training. All under Jeremy. But Jeremy hadn't built the path, he'd used one. A forgotten one. Miles recognized the architecture. He'd designed those ledgers to test multi-vendor logic with time-delayed fee staging, a financial stress simulation tool. It was never meant for live payments. It had been disabled, or so he thought. But someone had reactivated it, used it, and now they were burying expenses through it like it was nothing. The last confirmation came in a file from an off-site procurement mirror, an access log showing a remote session 2 months ago. IP was traced to a corporate apartment in Denver, rented under Rolex Holdings. Miles didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just opened his ch5_init folder and created a subfolder, ghost_vendor_set1. Then he placed everything inside. Names, addresses, sessions, metadata. In the final document, he typed just one line. The vendor is. He saved the folder, backed it up to an encrypted drive, then closed his laptop and sat still for 10 seconds. Not thinking about Jeremy, not even about Cassandra, just about the system. About how easily it had been turned against itself. Not by hacking, but by confidence. By the belief that no one who mattered would ever look beneath the formatting. Miles wasn't back to expose them. He was just following echoes, and one by one they were leading him somewhere deeper. Somewhere even more interesting than theft. Pattern. It started with a delay. Just 3 seconds longer than usual when Miles queried the internal payroll structure from his sandbox replica. That's all. But to him, delay wasn't lag. It was hesitation. Systems hesitate when they're choosing between two answers, one that's been dressed up and one that still wears its raw data. He ran the query again. Same parameters. This time the response came faster, but the hash didn't match the checksum from the first query, which meant something underneath was shifting or hiding. Miles ran a diff check. Nothing in the visible rows. The numbers aligned, the formatting pristine. But then he drilled down into the logic layer. Every query in the system pulled from payroll_master, except this one had a redirect path embedded inside the function call, an alias pointing to letter_alt_p. It was subtle, deep in the logic tree. You'd never see it unless you were watching the recursive fetch calls at sandbox level. But Miles wasn't just watching. He was listening. The alternate ledger was a mirror, one designed to mimic real payroll data but with subtle variance in only one field, contractor classification. In the original ledger, contractors had to be verified against a vendor registry. In the alternate, that check was skipped entirely, and that's where the second face lived. This face paid people who didn't exist, entities who had no EINs, no time logs, no compliance records. It didn't lie by omission, it lied by design. Miles followed one record. J. Rowan, Strategic Advisor, 11K/month. Sounds fine. Except there was no record of J. Rowan ever receiving a badge, submitting a timesheet, or even accessing a single company email. He wasn't real, just a name with an invoice, like a mask the system wore when someone inside didn't want to leave fingerprints. But they left them anyway, because the alternate ledger had a version history. Obscured, but not erased. It showed exactly who accessed and approved each record. And it told a story in 5 edits. 1. Entry created under ops_coup_coda_mail. 2. Flagged once by system for incomplete verification. 3. Overridden by user mvain_ops with comment. Legal phrasing approved. Finalized by automated routing from C_legal_mailer. 5. Hidden from front-end by logic patch dated 3 days before Miles's removal. It wasn't sloppy. It was intentional precision, too careful, too layered, and it only worked because someone with back-end access had built the scaffold for dual-truth accounting. That someone, unfortunately for them, was Miles. He had created sandbox mirrors during his tenure, not to deceive, but to test audit resilience. The alternate ledger was meant for internal simulation, a dry run environment, a truth testing field. But someone had turned it into a payment highway, and worse, they used his own structure to do it. Miles didn't feel violated, he felt curious. How far did they think this would go? He ran a recursive scan through the transaction logs. 58 entries tied to alternate ledger routes, 21 flagged as strategic contractor payments, 12 linked to vendors with incomplete filings, 7 routed through Delaware holding entities. The system didn't flag these because the logic tree had been patched, not rewritten, patched. That meant the original rules still lived underneath, hidden but intact. And patchwork can be peeled. Miles rolled back the sandbox to a timestamp 5 days before his termination. The patch vanished, the flags came back, and one by one the ghost contractors turned red. Not red for fraud, red for non-compliance escalation. That was the trigger the system had been suppressing. And now that the patch was temporarily lifted, the system showed what it had been trying to say for months. Not a glitch, not a leak, but a scream buried in silence. Miles saved the diff logs, the patch signature, and the reversal hashes, then backed up the entire alternate ledger under a new folder. ch5_ledger fork. His fingers paused for a moment, then typed one comment at the top. If you're going to lie, at least lie outside the structure I built to hold the truth. Then he encrypted the file, embedded a version hash trace, and sent a single silent ping to Lana's offsite archive node. Not the file, just the signature, the timestamp, enough to verify that something had been uncovered, something not yet spoken but now undeniably real. Somewhere across the city, Jeremy was preparing a presentation on operational efficiency gains through strategic outsourcing. He had no idea that every slide he'd built was about to be held next to a ledger he never thought would reappear. A ledger that wore two faces, and only one of them could look back. The file name was almost insulting. ____PDF. No context, no title, no revision history. It sat buried deep within an archive folder labeled INTG_FY21_MISC. Tucked inside a nested chain of backups from the compliance audit team's legal guidance cache, Miles only found it because he traced a broken link inside the alternate ledger's approval logic, one that pointed to a missing reference file used to justify consultant payment classifications. The system tried to resolve the document callout. It failed, but instead of going blank, the legacy backup reached further into Sandbox cache and returned this: 3_1 PDF, and a date modified that sent a chill down Miles's spine, 3 days after his access was revoked. He opened it. Slowly. No passwords, no watermarks, just a plain document with an internal template header. Operational budget adjustment pathways, legal guidance draft. But it wasn't a draft. It was a blueprint. The first page listed general procedures: expense bundling, classification variance language, justification routing. Dry, vague, the kind of corporate word salad that looks harmless until you realize its only real purpose is to make sure no one asks real questions. But the second page, that was where the lines got sharper. It described a framework for external strategic advisory intake, with tiers for vendor background requirements. Tier 1 required full verification. Tier 2 could use interim IDs. Tier 3? Discretionary validation, advised under internal operational oversight. Discretionary. It was a word designed to erase accountability while still sounding professional. A lawyer's camouflage. Miles read on. Embedded into the fourth page was a flowchart. One of the nodes, hexagonal, not standard square, read, redundant entries permissible under provisional consultancy classification if ledger path includes clause C6.333, exemption logic. He paused. C6.33 wasn't even a live clause anymore. It had been deprecated in system revision FY19Q4, and only one person had used it recently in any record trace: Marla Vane, CFO. He checked the file's metadata, author field, mvops.admin. But the system didn't just store usernames, it stored machine signatures. The originating device ID traced back to a company-issued laptop logged at an IP in a restricted office, Floor 8 Executive Wing. That wing only had 4 workstations with admin-level sandbox clearance. Miles knew. He assigned them. The file wasn't created by legal. It wasn't authored by a compliance team. It was built by someone inside ops and disguised as a legal suggestion. There was no cover memo. No email chain. Just this silent PDF sitting in a forgotten directory, quietly justifying thousands of dollars rerouted through advisory contracts that had no faces, no desks, and no voice. But now they had a witness. The final paragraph of the document contained one sentence that twisted everything. This protocol assumes containment within Tier 3 discretionary oversight, pending silent acknowledgement by relevant operational authorities. Silent acknowledgement. That meant it didn't need a signature, it only needed someone to not reject it. Inaction was approval. That's how they built it. They didn't forge records, they built systems that rewarded people for not asking questions. Miles saved the file to his ch5_struck proof folder. Then he resaved it under a different name, They Knew PUPL. He didn't add notes. He didn't need to. The document was its own confession. It didn't shout. It whispered behind everyone's back. It was policy written by people who wanted flexibility, not integrity. And it was embedded in systems designed to look clean on the surface, like a building with perfect architecture and rotting pipes underneath. He backed up the file to 3 places, one local, one cloud encrypted, one offline drive embedded in the backup server he still quietly accessed every Thursday night between 2 and 4 a.m., thanks to a firmware token the new IT head never found. Then he opened a blank text note and typed a message not meant to be sent, just meant to exist. If this was a draft, why did it get implemented 3 days after I was removed? And underneath it, they didn't forget the system. They just assumed it would forget them. He sat back, let the silence settle. No calls, no alarms, just the hum of a machine that still carried his fingerprint. And in that hum, he heard it again. Not revenge, resonance. The file came through on a Tuesday. Miles wasn't watching for it, not directly, but the server mirror he'd quietly reactivated 2 weeks earlier caught it in a sweep of unencrypted internal traffic. Most transfers in the company's financial system followed a predictable pattern. Secure envelope, token authenticated relay, encrypted in transit via standard TLS 1.3. This one didn't. It pinged twice. Once when it passed through the proxy relay marked legal_internal_ops, and again when it rerouted to payroll systems without authentication headers. That alone wasn't proof of fraud, but to Miles it was an invitation. He isolated the packet, ran it through forensic unpacking. What surfaced wasn't a document, it was a chain. A chain of internal approvals formatted as XML, mapping a transaction labeled training expense reallocation tier 3 discretion. The amount, $73,800.00. The recipient, Vera Consulting Group. Miles had seen that name before, in a memo 5 years ago, on a list of rejected vendors due to compliance violations. That vendor was dead, shut down after a failed background check. But here it was, resurrected, paid, and routed through internal channels. What made it worse wasn't the payment, it was who approved it. The digital signature at the bottom wasn't forged. It wasn't even hidden. It belonged to Marla Vane. But the real twist came from the message's timestamp metadata. The document was prepared at 3:47 a.m. EM, modified again at 4:01 dot, then sent, unencrypted, at 4:05 dot. Miles stared at the logs. No admin works at 4 a.m. unless they are hiding something or making sure no one sees it happen live. But Marla wasn't working alone. The system noted a second session connected through an alias account, Relay Ops XMSR. That tag wasn't native to the company. It was a custom alias used during vendor onboarding stress tests, long before Preston took over, and Miles had built it. It wasn't a backdoor. It was a trace port, created to simulate external vendor approval chains for security tests, and now someone was using it to route real payments on dead vendors. Miles traced the path. From Marla's machine, through the relay into payroll, then out to a Wells Fargo account under Vira Consulting's name, registered in Phoenix, Arizona. But the kicker? The owner on the account wasn't Vera, it was a personal name. Miles froze when he read it. Jeremy Thomas Lynn, COO, current, active. His name wasn't listed as the receiver, just as the secondary approver on the linked account. Enough to get alerts, enough to pull, not enough to trigger red flags. Unless someone knew where to look, Miles looked, and he documented. He captured the packet, saved the full XML with digital signature trail, logged the dual timestamps, ran a hash on the original payload, and verified it through the sandbox system, the one that had flagged the vendor 5 years ago. The logic held. The system hadn't failed. It had been bypassed, not broken, dodged. But because someone forgot to encrypt it, the system spoke. Softly, clearly, Miles didn't need access to their inbox. The server told him everything. He created a new subfolder in ch5_struck_proof and named it wiretrail_Vera. Inside, he saved the full XML, signature certificate trace, session logs from Marla's machine, background scan on Vira Consulting, account registration docs for Jeremy Lynn, quietly pulled from an identity verification API. He didn't send them, not yet. Just pinned the folder for timed release on his backup server. An automatic forward trigger set for 14 days later if no reset key was entered, not as a threat, as insurance, as truth with a fuse. Because now he knew, and the system knew, and somewhere, deep in the very logic tree they tried to overwrite, the red flag was pulsing again. Quiet. Waiting. But live. That was the mistake. Not the fraud. Not the signatures. But the assumption that no one was listening. That silence meant safety. That no encryption meant no trail. But Miles? He was the trail. And he was just getting started. It began with a return address, simple, unassuming. A line at the bottom of a payment authorization PDF. Vendor Office 1447, E-PO Box 3321, Wilmington, DE. Delaware. Miles had seen that zip before, too many times in too many shell companies. It wasn't just a state, it was a strategy. The file came from a transaction flagged under a forgotten vendor named Solvex Partners, but it sounded clean, legitimate, like the kind of name someone picks from a random syllable generator after lunch. But Miles wasn't interested in branding. He was interested in footprints. He ran the address through a registrar search and came back with 4 active corporations, all tied to the same box: Solvex Partners, LLC, Horizon Metrics, Inc., Delta Climb Solutions, and Corin Advisory. Different names, different tax IDs, but all opened within 14 months of each other, and each with a single digital commonality. Every bank routing number led to the same regional branch in Phoenix, Arizona. That mattered, because Phoenix was where the trail from Vira Consulting ended, and more importantly, where Jeremy's digital fingerprints had last surfaced. Miles dug deeper. He pulled archived payment records, mirroring them against internal ledger entries. What emerged wasn't a straight line. It was a circle. Company A paid Company B for strategy consulting. Company B paid Company C for workflow optimization. Company C reimbursed Company D for talent reskilling. Company D paid Company A for executive advisory. One loop, 4 faces. No deliverables, no reports, no client correspondence, just movement. Clean, round, and intentionally directionless. It wasn't theft, it was laundering. Sanitized by paperwork, masked by terminology, hidden in the folds of operational complexity. And on paper, it worked, because each transfer was technically legal. But Miles didn't live on paper, he lived in pattern. And this pattern didn't just smell wrong, it moved too perfectly, too cleanly. Because underneath all the transactions was a rhythm, a heartbeat. Every 14 days, 4 payments, 4 companies, same loop. It wasn't organic, it was scripted. He checked the automation logs. Nothing showed up in the main system, but on the old dev branch, Miles' original sandbox, he found it. A custom scheduler script labeled Loop Ghost Bat, last modified 8 months ago. Creator tag JJLINX X.NEXT. Jeremy again. It wasn't a smoking gun, it was a printing press, designed to spin advisory money through corporate veils until it came back home dressed in legitimacy. Miles recreated the flowchart, labeled each vendor, cross-checked dates with major internal budget cuts. Every time staff were laid off, consulting payments surged across the loop. Payroll down, vendor spend up. Same net output, different narrative. And the narrative was everything, because Miles had just enough data now to do something they never expected. Map it. Visually. Undeniably, he fed the structure into a node tracing software and let it build the spiderweb. At the center, Jeremy. Not named, not directly, but all points curved back to accounts he had access to, approvals he had touched, aliases tied to machines he once logged into. Miles backed everything up, gave it a name, cleanloop_cartel PB. Then he added one final piece, an article from 4 years ago, saved long before any of this started. It featured a boutique startup in Boston that specialized in creating shell consultancy models for executive insulation. One of the co-founders, Cassandra Lynn Baird. Same name, same digital signature he'd traced in 5.2. But this time, she wasn't just Jeremy's ex. She was a builder, an architect. The entire loop was based on a financial model she once pitched publicly. And now, it was live. Inside a system Miles had helped construct. Not to enable fraud, but to reveal it, eventually, if someone ever listened. Miles whispered to the empty room, "I'm listening," then added one more file to the folder, an internal IT note from 4 months ago, requesting server access logs to be purged under the guise of performance cleanup. The request was signed off by a junior admin under pressure. Miles knew the signs, knew that's when people start erasing. Not because they fear being caught, but because someone above them made them feel small enough to obey. But he wasn't small, not anymore, and neither was the case. The loop was real, and someone, somewhere, was about to find out that erasing the past doesn't make it disappear. It just makes the echo louder when it returns. The invite went out at 3:14 a.m., no subject line, no calendar title, just a blank square marked Review Block Internal. It wasn't scheduled through Outlook. It wasn't approved by Ops. It was created through a sandboxed calendar tool Miles had once written himself, back when system audits needed quiet rooms and quieter attention. 4 people received it. Clara, head of audit; Lana, formerly of compliance, now quietly reassigned to special oversight; a mid-level systems accountant named Devin Hale. Quiet, methodical, never spoken above a whisper. And Miles, operating entirely off the grid. Listed not by name, but by a hash-based alias the system still trusted because no one had told it otherwise. They met in a disused training room 3 floors below the main offices. Room B217. It had no camera, no audio system, and still smelled faintly of whiteboard markers and old coffee. No one from the executive tier was invited. That was intentional. Miles arrived first, laptop in hand, already running a visual ledger map pulled from the loop. Clara entered next, holding a printed copy of the alternate ledger Miles had sent 3 nights earlier, disguised as a sandbox simulation. Lana followed, saying nothing, but her eyes scanned everything. Devin came last, pale, shaking slightly, in his hand a thumb drive. Clara broke the silence. "This meeting never happened. We agree?" Nods. Lana turned to Devin. "What you have... Did anyone else see it?" He shook his head. "I didn't even know I still had access. I saved it. From months ago. I thought it was weird, the email phrasing, but then they said Miles was gone and the system cleared out his tier. I figured maybe I shouldn't delete it." Miles spoke for the first time. "You didn't." Not a question, a statement. Devin placed the drive on the table like it was heavier than it looked. Miles opened the contents, a cache of internal emails. 3 threads, all routed through C_legal_mailer, all approved by Jeremy or Marla, all referencing payout structures with wording almost identical to the draft file named ____PDF. The kicker? One email showed the phrase silent loop routing confirmed, mirror mask intact. It wasn't just cover, it was coordination. Clara tapped her finger on the page. "This confirms usage of your sandbox loop, Miles, the one no one outside DevOps was supposed to touch." Miles nodded. "It's been active for at least 14 months, tracing out through 4 companies. They're laundering through legitimate payroll masks." Lana narrowed her eyes. "And no one at Legal questioned it?" "Legal didn't write it," Miles said. "Ops disguised it as legal phrasing. Legal never saw the full flow." Clara exhaled. "This means we have a silent fraud model operating under compliance disguise. No system alerts, no whistleblower trail, just silence." "Until now," Miles said. Lana turned to him. "Why bring us in? Why not take this straight to board oversight?" Miles leaned forward, voice calm. "Because I don't need oversight. I need witnesses." Devin flinched. Clara's jaw tightened. Lana stayed still. But none of them objected. Because they understood. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about pattern, structure, and memory. About a system that had been bent slowly, silently, until it looked normal from the outside. But they were inside now, and the view was different. Clara stood and wrote a date on the board. June 14. That's when the audit committee meets. Public review. External eyes. We submit a logic integrity report quietly. Just flags. No names. Let the system speak. If the flags match what Miles has, we escalate, Lana added. And if they don't? Then I make sure they do, Miles said, with or without them. For a long second, no one moved. Then Devin reached into his pocket, pulled out a printed copy of the first email he'd never deleted. It was wrinkled, faded at the corners, but the header was clear. Miles smiled faintly. The accountant who never deleted the email. Devin looked away, embarrassed, but Miles added, softer. That one click started all this. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't hesitation. It was alignment, understanding. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the moment the system stopped whispering and started preparing to speak. It was supposed to be a formality, a sandbox integrity scan, routine, quiet, internal, the kind of exercise Clara had requested dozens of times over the years to satisfy board policy. But this one wasn't routine, not this time. The request had been structured as a quarterly redundancy stress test, the kind legal barely glanced at anymore. It asked for no names, no blame, just a scan, a check on logical consistency between system ledger pathways and payment justification trees. Harmless, invisible. But beneath that request lived a purpose built entirely by Miles. The scan began at 10 o'clock IMing sharp on a Friday, run from an isolated system node called Mirror Delta, a legacy sandbox that had long been disconnected from central payroll, or so they thought. Miles had quietly reconnected it 3 weeks earlier through a buried patch script, one that mirrored live transaction logic without flagging any source files. It didn't rewrite, it watched. The scan took 42 minutes. It produced a single output file, logic_conflict_tree_v5d7, line, size 1.8 MB. Lines 1,492. Within that file were 14 flagged entries, each marked Compliance Shadow Detected. None had associated tag logs, none had full ledger lineage, but each carried a redirect tag tied to Tier 3 discretionary routing. Lena reviewed the file first. Her hand visibly tightened on the mouse. Clara looked over her shoulder and whispered, "That's the loop." Miles said nothing. Just plugged in a slim black USB drive, opened a folder labeled CH5_public view, and dragged in the scan result. The room was empty except for the three of them, but the presence was heavy. Because this wasn't a theoretical scan anymore. It was proof. The system hadn't just been bent, it had been taught to bend by people who trusted no one would ask where the logic came from. But Miles had asked. And the answers had finally arrived. Each of the flagged entries mapped directly to the contractor payments, routed through the ghost vendors from earlier investigations. Vira, Solvex, Haverly, Horizon Metrics. Every name, every transfer, now lived in the output as a contradiction. Because the system had been told to follow rules, but someone had quietly rewritten which rules it was allowed to remember. Until now, Clara clicked through the records. One by one, the entries unfolded. 3 had Jeremy's alias, 4 were routed through Marla's machine ID, 2 still carried open vendor access tokens, even though the vendors had been decommitted. One record in particular stood out. Entry 12, Corin Advisory. It had processed a $38,500 0 cents payment just 2 days ago after the scan request had been filed, which meant the loop wasn't historical, it was live. Clara whispered, "They're still running it." Lana nodded. "They think no one's watching." Miles copied the conflict tree, signed it digitally with a hash trace, and added a comment. Test scan triggered 10 o'clock IEM. No anomalies returned until logic tree unmasked by rollback patch, meaning the system didn't detect corruption because corruption rewrote the system's questions. No one responded. They didn't need to. The numbers were the response. The ghost contractors, the vendor shells, the double ledger, they were no longer theories. They were code, visible, traceable, legal. Didn't need to sign off. The system had. Miles closed the file and looked at Clara. "This gets submitted Monday to the audit board." She nodded. "Just as a logic integrity concern, no accusations, no conclusions." "But enough," Lana said quietly to make the board flinch. Miles smiled. Not with triumph, but clarity. "They don't need to believe me. They just need to see what I saw." He unplugged the USB. "Once they do, they'll realize the system isn't broken. It's finally being honest." He turned to leave, but before reaching the door, he paused. "If Jeremy shows up late to Monday's meeting, don't wait for him. Just open the file and let it speak first." Then he walked out, leaving behind no headline, no war cry, just a folder on a drive and a system that no longer knew how to lie for the people who had built their careers teaching it how. The boardroom didn't erupt. It rarely did. Noise was for middle management. In this room, silence was the alarm. When the audit packet landed in their shared drive Monday morning, it didn't come with bold fonts or accusations, just a file name. Mirror Delta _ integrity scan, GNO, no author, no cover note. But the internal hash certification showed 3 layers of authentication, all tied to the legacy sandbox system no one on the board had touched in years. The first to open it was Catherine Alston, the board's longest-sitting compliance chair. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't need to be. 40 minutes later, she forwarded the file to 3 other directors with a single message. You'll want to see this. No discussion over email. By 11:42 a.m., the group had met in a private subroom 2 floors above the main conference center. No assistants, no tech, just paper copies, printed from a secure air-gapped device and a shared understanding that what they were about to read wasn't supposed to exist. The JSON output was dense but not unreadable. Catherine had highlighted the key flags. 14 conflict entries, each tied to contractor payments routed through systems that bypassed traditional compliance pathways. One entry included a system comment, clause C6.33, override accepted via legacy patch protocol. Another, vendor ID orphaned, payment path unresolved, no 1099 issued. The final one simply read, classification, mirror ledger only, no master ledger twin detected. No one spoke for a full minute. Then Matthew Bryce, CFO Advisory Committee Chair, cleared his throat. Who signed off on this audit? Catherine flipped to the system log summary. No one. It was triggered through an automated redundancy check, scheduled by Clara. Logic tree match confirmed by sandbox protocol from legacy infrastructure. Legacy, he repeated. That sandbox still runs? Apparently, she said, and apparently it remembers. Bryce leaned back. So, this was silent? It was honest, Catherine corrected. The system didn't flag the transactions because someone told it not to. This scan rolled back the conditions and the flags reappeared. And who built that rollback? Catherine didn't answer, but the implication sat thick in the air. Miles Conway, the man they let go without resistance, the architect of their audit tree. The voice the system still carried. Is this definitive? Bryce asked. Catherine nodded. It's verifiable. The trace logs map out a loop. 4 vendors, cycling payments, no deliverables, routed through discretionary budget masks and ledger forks. It's not just questionable, it's patterned. Another board member spoke. Samantha, legal oversight? Is anyone named? No, Catherine said. No users, just system traces, aliases, file paths, device IDs. Clever, Samantha murmured. A confession without confrontation. Then she turned the page. This one. Entry 12. It processed a payment 2 days ago. Which means, Catherine said, it's still active. The room shifted. The air got heavier. Not with panic, but with the realization that this wasn't a matter of potential liability, it was current, ongoing, and traceable. What's our exposure? Bryce asked. Unknown, Catherine replied. But whoever ran this didn't go public. They gave us a choice, to act or not. And if we don't, Samantha said. Catherine looked at the final comment printed at the bottom of the JSON file. Added by the system automatically, not a person. Integrity loop has self-reported, awaiting oversight acknowledgement, not demand, not escalation. Just a system waiting to see if anyone would bother looking back. Bryce rubbed his temples. Do you think this goes to Preston? Eventually, Catherine said, but not yet. We need verification, and a question answered. What question? She passed him a second page, a flowchart. The full mirror logic map, nodes traced back to device fingerprints. 3 IDs, 1 tagged to Jeremy's old consulting laptop, 1 to Marla's workstation, and 1 had no name, just a system alias, MC_legacy, auth 154. Bryce read the signature, then looked up. Miles? The system still recognizes him, Catherine said, even though we stopped using his name. For a long time, the board didn't speak. Then Bryce set the file down, tapped it twice, and said the only thing that mattered. Find out if Conway's still in town. No one asked why. Because deep down, they already knew the system hadn't betrayed them. It had simply waited. And now that it was finally heard, the board had a choice to make. Speak or stay silent and let the code continue its quiet, perfect memory of everything they'd tried to rewrite. The call came in just after 2:00 o'clock IEM. Not to Preston, not to Jeremy. It went straight to a private line, a number routed through 3 layers of VoIP masking reserved for emergencies no one ever expected to use. On the other end was a voice Preston hadn't heard in 9 months. Edward Halverson, former CEO, still holding silent shares, still attending quarterly calls off record, still watching. The kind of man whose absence was louder than presence. Is Conway still in town? That was all he asked. No greeting, no background, just a sentence loaded with the weight of someone who'd seen the report. Preston hesitated. We haven't heard from him since. That's not what I asked. The pause that followed wasn't for effect. It was for calculation. Because Preston knew what the question meant. It wasn't about geography. It was about systems. Access, echoes. We removed his credentials. IT scrubbed everything. Then why is the system still signing his audit tools? Edward's voice was flat. The board saw the report. Mirror Delta, legacy logic rollback. They traced the output hashes. He didn't send the file. But the system acknowledged him. Preston swallowed. The air in his office suddenly felt thinner. We assumed he... That's your first mistake, Edward interrupted. You assumed. He built the structure you're standing on, Preston. If you're still breathing, it's because he never coded vengeance into the walls. Silence. Then Edward added, lower now. And if I were you, I'd ask myself something real simple. Do I want him to speak next, or the system? The line went dead. Preston stared at the receiver, heart like a metronome on overdrive. He turned toward his laptop, hands moving on instinct. He pulled up internal logs, opened the secure admin view, searched for any access tied to MC_legacy auth 154. It was there. Timestamped active. Active. 3 days ago. Routing through Sandbox Mirror servers he didn't even know were still powered. No name, no IP. Just a pulse. A whisper. Preston tried to launch a shutdown. Denied. Sandbox was air-gapped, legacy authenticated. Miles's old architecture still held primary override at the firmware level, because no one had ever disabled it, because no one thought they needed to. He looked up the list of people who'd had access to that system in the last 90 days. There were only 2, Clara and Lana. Both had submitted integrity files. Neither had named Miles. They hadn't needed to. The system had done it for them. Preston picked up his phone, tried to dial Clara, stopped. Tried Jeremy, thought better. In the end, he called no one, because there was only one number he should have called 9 months ago, after that Zoom termination, after that line about cost optimization, after the man who built the backbone of their financial system walked away without raising his voice. But that number wasn't on his phone anymore. It had been deleted. Like everything else, except nothing in Miles Conway's world was ever truly deleted. Only redirected. Archived. Waiting. Preston sat back, eyes fixed on the flickering monitor, watching system logs scroll in silence. A line appeared. Sandbox checksum integrity confirmed. Mirror rollback complete. Ledger variance match. 14. Below that, a message. Response window pending. He didn't know who programmed that message. He didn't know what would happen if the window closed. But something in him, buried under titles and confidence and quarterly gains, knew what the system was saying. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was just waiting for someone to realize that the man they cut out of the system had never actually left. Some people leave by walking out the door. Others leave by letting silence do the walking for them. Threaded into every line of logic they once touched, Miles never raised a hand, never sent a warning, never shouted into the void. He just left the system, honest enough to echo. And when the day came that lies grew too thick for human eyes to parse, the code remembered. Not with accusation, but with architecture. That's the thing they never understood. He didn't build firewalls to keep people out. He built mirrors to reflect who they became when they thought no one was watching. And when the system finally spoke, it didn't point fingers. It asked questions. The kind of questions only the guilty find uncomfortable. Not because they didn't know the answers, but because they knew someone else finally did. Miles didn't need to return. His legacy never logged out. It stayed buried in fallback servers, in sandbox protocols, in forgotten patches he'd written to protect truth from entropy. And when they tried to overwrite that truth with clean spreadsheets and polished fraud, the system pushed back. Not with chaos, but with clarity. The loop exposed itself, not through whistleblowers or hacks, but through pattern, through quiet consistency. And in that consistency was the voice they tried to erase. So if you think silence is weakness, you've never met a system that's been betrayed. Because the loudest, revenge isn't delivered in the boardroom. It unfolds in the logic trees no one dared inspect, until they couldn't look away. That's where Miles won, not with a headline, but with a checksum. Not by confronting the enemy, but by trusting the math. And when the board leaned in to whisper, "Is Conway still in town?" the system already knew the answer. It had known all along. So, if you build anything, systems, legacies, or lines of defense, build them so well that even your silence makes noise. And just as the ones at the top began to lose their grip on the system they thought they controlled, a quiet access ping appeared from a forgotten corner of the office. From a name they no longer remembered. But Miles did. He didn't need to tear the walls down, just press on the right brick, one old folder, one payroll sheet, one number that didn't fit, and the first person to see it was the intern who once stayed late to fix mistakes no one else would. The story isn't over. It's only beginning right where no one was looking. If you found this story powerful, comment 1 below. And what happens next? When Miles reaches out to Haley, the only one who ever believed him, will take the silence to a whole new level. Don't miss it.